Well, beloved, today we get one of those passages from the Gospel of Luke that kinds of challenges any idea we have about Jesus being about family values. The family values he's espousing are a little different than what we often hear said. Jesus said, "I came to bring fire to the earth, and how I wish it were already kindled. I have a baptism with which to be baptized, and what stress I am under until it is completed. Do you think that I have come to bring peace to the earth? No, I tell you, but rather division. From now on, 5 in one household will be divided, 3 against 2 and 2 against 3. They will be divided. Father against son, and son against father. Mother against daughter, and daughter against mother. Mother-in-law against her daughter-in-law, and daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law, though that one seems a lot more believable than some of the others. I've seen that before. But what's going on here? Lion and the lamb. This is what we usually think of as Jesus. We think of Jesus as bringing peace, as being a messenger of peace. What is going on here? Are we getting some idea of Jesus as kind of the Rambo Christ here? Is that what's going on? Are we talking about Jesus proclaiming the wrath of God? And this is kind of how we look at the wrath of God, of Jesus, or God sending a lightning bolt down to strike a specific point on the earth. But what if it's not really about, Jesus isn't really talking about God's wrath? What if he's not talking about that he's imposing it? What if the problem isn't God's, but ours? Where does our desire come from? Everything good and everything bad in humanity comes from our desires to do good, our desires to do evil. And for you guys who don't recognize, this is Justin Bieber back here. I know, you heard his name. You know who the Beepster is. Desire. Where does it come from and how does it travel? Rene Girard, who's a modern philosopher, anthropologist, and theologian, says desire is something that we borrow from others. It's something that travels. It's almost viral. And you can see this in this kind of phenomenon. Go all the way back to Elvis or go back to the Beatles. It's not like thousands and thousands of American girls just decided that 4 guys from Liverpool looked good independently. It travels from place to place. It's almost viral. We see somebody desiring something else, and we desire it ourselves. All of modern advertising works on this principle. This idea that, if you use this product, you would like to look like me. If you use this product, you'll look like me. Now, we all know that's not true, but that's what works on us on an almost subconscious level. We have this desire is transmitted between us as groups and as individuals. And it almost follows, it's very similar to the cycle of domestic abuse, the way we deal with this tension of desire builds and builds and builds within a society until it has to be released. And then after the tension building, there's the incident phase where something happens, something is done to release the tension, then reconciliation and calm, and the society is returned back to the point that it can function again. We can see this in ancient societies, in ancient Aztec culture, where they would have these ball games, and then whoever won the ball game would be celebrated as a king for a year and then sacrificed to the gods. This was a common theme in ancient pagan cultures, is that you would take the person up and raise them up and then sacrifice them. And gosh, we still have that image in movies today, whether it's Jack Sparrow being sacrificed by the native tribe who found him, or Joe versus the volcano, where you hire the person to go be the person sacrificed to the volcano. Thank God we've gotten past that, and we don't blame people irrationally for things. Too soon still? Anyhow. People often ask, why do we hold sports figures up? Every time we have a sports figure fall from grace, we ask, why do we do that? We ask ourselves this over and over again. It's because we're no different than the Aztecs. We want to hold them up, and then once they disappoint us, then we want to sacrifice them. I remember when back several years, just after he had went to the Vikings, there was this Remington was running this special of you can win a hunting trip with Brett Favre. And I went to a Gander Mountain here and a Gander Mountain in Kentucky, and they were advertising it in Kentucky and not here for some reason. For some reason, they thought sending Brett Favre out into the duck blind with a guy with a gun wasn't a good idea in Wisconsin. Or way too soon. Sorry. Way too soon. Or a little less soon. We hold these icons up for no particularly good reason. And then when we fall, we have the need to sacrifice. This is inherent in our persons as human beings. They had a fairly straightforward way of handling this in the Old Testament. They literally had a scapegoat. This is where we get this term from, is every year the sins of Israel would be transferred onto a goat, and then the goat would be sent off into the wilderness to die. And so every year the people would have a huge ceremony that transferred their sins onto the goat and sent off into the wilderness. The idea being that at one point this scapegoat was probably a person back in prehistory. And by the time of the Bible, they had moved to the point where they could transfer it onto a goat instead of a person. Indeed, when we get to the story of Abraham and Isaac, this story of Abraham being commanded by God to sacrifice Isaac, we look at that and we say, how could God ask that? How could anybody believe that God would ask that? Well, Abraham believed it because all gods in the ancient Near East could ask that. Human sacrifice was not an unusual thing. Asking to sacrifice your firstborn son was not an unusual thing at the time. The fact that we look back on it and don't understand it is what's unusual. And why have we had that transformation? Why has that changed in our society? Why do we look at that human sacrifice as something unusual rather than something normal? Well, Girard would say it was Jesus. That Jesus, when Jesus dies upon the cross as the perfectly blameless man, as God, he starts something. He changes something in the way that humans begin to think. Jesus doesn't die to appease a wrathful God. God dies in order to appease a wrathful humanity and to break this cycle of violence. God doesn't nail Jesus to the cross. We've got to remember that. That was humans. Human power and desire does that. But it takes a long, long time for humanity to learn the lesson. He likens it to yeast. He says it's like putting yeast into bread. It doesn't automatically pop up. It takes a while for the yeast to move throughout the dough and then to start to make it rise. But we start to see how once this perfect sacrifice has taken place that we demand, that things start to change in human societies. One example he uses is sexism. There was a time when the human family was held together by violence. Yeah, it's a great... I don't know whether that's actually original or somebody wrote that in, but it's a great quote anyhow. It is something Jughead might say. One example is that at one time the human family was held together by a threat of male violence. That men were in charge, and if the children or the women were uppity, you had the legal right to abuse them. I mean, if you know anything about some of the way terms work, one of the supposed origins of the term rule of thumb is that you could use, legally in Britain, you could use any rod up to the size of your thumb to beat your wife, and that was okay. If you went over that, then you could be prosecuted. And what Girard says, as families have become rightly and goodly more egalitarian, we've had a hard time dealing with that because of the discord, because of we don't know, the roles aren't as planed out, that we don't have a way to release that tension within the family. So it's caused things like divorce. The rise of divorce in some ways has to do with our egalitarian view. And it's not a bad thing. It's just hard for us to deal with. Christ shows us the way of love is needed in order to be able to desire with one desire as husbands and wives, without having to resort to the old sacrificial order of wives deferring to their husbands. And the system fights back. This is the other thing that Girard says. Girard actually calls this cycle Satan. He says this is where evil comes from in the world, is this cycle. And it fights against those who would oppose it. People like Nelson Mandela or Desmond Tutu or the Dalai Lama. People who oppose it are persecuted and sometimes killed, whether you're talking about Jonathan Daniels or Mahatma Gandhi, or probably our most familiar figure in America.
And I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
That video, that moment where he almost seems to realize that he's not going to survive the next few days. That's the night before he's assassinated. It fights back. The system fights back because it's so much easier to be in the cycle of sacred violence than it is to embrace something much harder. It even finds its way into the church. Human division increases as sacred violence becomes less and less effective. And it applies to the church just like any other human organization. If we leave ourselves completely on our own, if we just function as a human organization, we are as fallen as any other part of society. Our only hope is to remember the one who stuck the screwdriver in the spokes of the mechanism of sacred violence. And that's Jesus and his sacrifice on the cross. Jesus died for us, but he did more than just die. His death reverberated throughout the human race, and his death as the perfect and blameless victim of our runaway desire takes away our ability to scapegoat bit by bit. The harmonics of that unjust ultimate sacrifice make us question things that we used to take as granted for a race. Things like war always being justified, or the fitness of capital punishment, or the justification of torture, or the institution of slavery. All things that were universally accepted before the time of Christ. Jesus had a cosmic effect. But as we question those methods of violence that used to be assumed in our culture, we struggle with how to maintain cohesion without coercion. And that cohesion is to be found in the worship of God and in the baptismal covenant we make to honor the dignity of every human being. Jesus does not cause the division that he talks about, but the very act of his removing our ability to scapegoat each other in the name of God causes us to divide ourselves in confusion. As we come to the table today, we need to remember what brings us here. The Eucharist is not primarily about recharging our spiritual batteries, although it does that. The Eucharist is a sacrament of unity. It reminds us that we're all sisters and brothers, united in following the one who came to break the cycle of violence. Amen.